Eli Whitmore didn't look like someone worth watching. He wore a faded gray hoodie, scuffed sneakers, and carried a backpack that had seen better days. No flashy watch, no designer sunglasses, no entourage, at least not the kind people usually picture. Just two quiet men in dark jackets sitting a few rows behind him, eyes always scanning, never lingering too long in one place. To most passengers boarding the late afternoon flight from London to New York, he was just another college kid heading home for the holidays. He'd spent the last 4 months studying abroad, urban design in Barcelona, and was tired in that deep, bone-settled way that only comes after weeks of packing goodbyes and airport lines. All he wanted was to curl up in his seat, listen to some music, and sleep through most of the 8-hour flight. He'd even skipped the usual pre-flight coffee, knowing caffeine would keep him wired. Instead, he sipped water and tried to ignore the low hum of chatter around him. Business class wasn't crowded, but it wasn't empty either. A few executives tapped away on laptops, a couple whispered over wine, and near the front an older woman fussed with her scarf. Eli's seat was by the window, his request, and he'd already pulled the shade halfway down to block the fading afternoon light. He plugged in his earbuds, queued up a playlist of lo-fi beats, and leaned back, eyes closed, across the aisle. Dale Mercer was already in a mood. He'd missed his original flight due to a delayed train, argued with a gate agent over seat selection, and now found himself stuck in a middle seat, despite paying extra for an exit row. He blamed everyone but himself, the airline, the weather, the incompetent staff. He ordered a whiskey from the first drink service and downed it fast, then asked for another before the plane even reached cruising altitude. Dale wasn't a bad-looking man, clean-shaven, neatly dressed in a button-down shirt, but there was a tightness around his eyes, a kind of simmering impatience that made people give him a wide berth. He kept glancing at his watch, then out the window, then at the flight attendants as if they were personally responsible for the jet lag he hadn't even gotten yet. The trouble started small. When the plane leveled off and the seatbelt sign clicked off, Eli reached for his water bottle, which had rolled slightly under the armrest during takeoff. As he leaned across the narrow aisle to retrieve it, his elbow brushed against Dale's armrest, just barely. Barely enough to make the plastic creak. Dale jerked his arm back like he'd been burned. "Watch it," he muttered, voice low but sharp. Eli paused, then looked over. "Sorry," he said simply, holding up his hands like he was surrendering. "Didn't mean to bump you." Dale didn't respond. Just stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Eli figured that was the end of it. He sat back, took a sip of water, and tried to sink back into his music. But Dale wasn't done. A few minutes later, Eli leaned forward to ask a passing flight attendant for a blanket. He'd forgotten his jacket and the cabin was getting chilly. As he spoke, his shoulder shifted slightly and again, the armrest between them made a soft clicking sound. That's when Dale snapped. He turned his head slowly, eyes narrowed, and said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "Watch where you're flailing, boy." The word landed like a stone in still water. Eli froze. Not out of fear, more out of disbelief. He was 19, raised in a home where respect was taught early and enforced gently. He'd heard that tone before in certain neighborhoods from certain people, but never so brazenly. Not in broad daylight, not on a packed international flight. He didn't react right away. Just looked at Dale for a long moment, steady and calm, like he was trying to figure out if this was real or some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Then he said, quietly, "My name's not Boy, and I didn't touch you." Dale's face reddened. He sat up straighter, puffing his chest like he was preparing for a fight. "You think I'm blind? You've been knocking into my seat since we took off. Maybe learn some manners before you get on a plane." A few passengers glanced over. One woman pulled her headphones off. The flight attendant hovering nearby hesitated, sensing the shift in the air. Eli kept his voice even. "I said I was sorry the first time. I didn't do it on purpose, but Dale wasn't listening. He was past reason now, fueled by alcohol and something deeper. Something older than this flight, older than this day." He stood up suddenly, chair scraping loudly against the floor. That's when the two men in dark jackets moved. Not dramatically. Not with guns drawn or shouts, just smooth, practiced motion. One rose from his seat 3 rows back and stepped into the aisle, blocking Dale's path without touching him. The other stayed seated but turned fully toward the commotion. hand resting lightly on his knee, ready but not threatening. "Sir," the first bodyguard said, voice calm but firm, "please sit down." Dale blinked, thrown off by the sudden presence. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm security, and I'm asking you nicely to return to your seat." For a second, Dale looked confused, like he hadn't considered that this kid might have protection. But pride kicked in fast. He scoffed, waving a hand. "This is ridiculous. I'm just telling him to keep his hands to himself." Eli hadn't moved. He was still seated, hands in his lap, but his breathing had changed. Shallow, controlled. He knew what was coming. He'd been trained for this, not because his father was wealthy, but because the world had shown, again and again, that being young, black, and unassuming didn't always keep you safe, even when you did everything right. Then it happened. Without warning, Dale lunged forward, not far, just enough, and slapped Eli across the face. The sound was sharp. Wet, unmistakable gasps filled the cabin. A child cried out. Someone shouted, "Hey!" Another passenger stood up, phone already recording. Eli's head snapped to the side, but he didn't cry out. Didn't flinch beyond the impact. He just sat there for a heartbeat, stunned, the sting blooming hot on his cheek. Then his eyes met Dale's, and in them was not anger, but something colder. Disappointment. Like he'd hoped until that very second that people could be better. The bodyguard didn't hesitate. He stepped in, placing himself fully between Dale and Eli. "You just assaulted a minor," he said, voice low but carrying. "You're not going anywhere." Dale tried to backpedal. "It was just a tap." He was being disrespectful, but the damage was done. The second bodyguard was already on his radio, speaking in clipped, professional tones to the cockpit. Within seconds, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but urgent, asking all passengers to remain seated while the crew addressed an in-flight security matter. No one panicked. But everyone knew this flight wasn't going to New York. Eli finally stood slowly, rubbing his cheek. He looked around, not for sympathy, but for confirmation that what had happened was real. Dozens of eyes met his, some wide with shock, some filled with quiet fury. A few looked away, uncomfortable. He nodded once to his bodyguard, then sat back down. He didn't say another word. But inside, something had shifted. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It was a moment, one that would ripple far beyond this plane, this day. This angry man in a wrinkled shirt. And as the aircraft began its slow turn toward the nearest diversion airport, the hum of the engine sounded different, heavier, like the sky itself was holding its breath. The cabin didn't erupt into chaos, not the kind you see in movies, but the air changed. It got thick like walking through fog. People stopped talking. Headphones came off. Even the baby two rows up went quiet, as if sensing something serious had just happened. Eli stayed seated, his fingers lightly pressed to his cheek. It stung, but the real pain wasn't physical. It was the way Dale had looked at him, like he wasn't even human, like a slap was all it took to put him in his place. Eli had grown up hearing stories from his father about being followed in stores, questioned in elevators, treated like a threat just for existing in certain spaces. But he'd hoped things were getting better, that maybe by now a kid in a hoodie on a plane wouldn't be seen as dangerous. He was wrong. One of the bodyguards, tall, calm, with a voice that sounded like gravel wrapped in velvet, stepped closer to Dale, who was now trying to act like nothing had happened. "Sit down," the man said, not loud but with a weight that made Dale's shoulders tense. "You're not going anywhere." Dale scoffed, arms crossed. "I didn't do anything illegal." He was being rude. "No," the bodyguard said evenly. "You struck a 19-year-old who hadn't raised his voice. That's assault. And we're treating it as such." A flight attendant approached, her face pale but composed. "Is everything okay?" "Not really," the bodyguard replied. "We need to speak with the captain immediately." She nodded and hurried toward the cockpit. Within minutes, the plane began a slow, wide turn. The seatbelt sign dinged back on. A murmur spread through the cabin. Someone whispered, "Are we landing?" Another passenger checked their phone. No signal, of course, but the gesture was automatic, like hoping for answers from a world outside this metal tube. Eli finally stood. Not to confront Dale, there was no point, but to stretch his legs to remind himself he still had control over his own body. His second bodyguard moved with him, staying half a step behind, eyes scanning the cabin. Not for threats exactly, but for reactions. Who was recording? Who looked angry? Who seemed ready to help? A woman in the row ahead turned around. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Eli gave her a small nod. "Yeah, just shocked." She reached into her bag and handed him a napkin. "For your face. It's a little red." He took it, murmuring thanks. That small act of kindness, the quiet concern in her eyes, meant more than he could say. It reminded him that not everyone saw him the way Dale did. Up front, the lead bodyguard was speaking with the captain through the cockpit door. They kept their voices low, but the message was clear. This wasn't a minor disturbance. An adult had physically attacked a young man without provocation. Given the circumstances and the fact that Eli was a minor traveling under private security detail, the captain had no choice. Safety protocols required immediate action. "We're diverting to Shannon Airport in Ireland," the captain announced over the intercom a few minutes later. "We expect to land in approximately 40 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Local authorities will meet us on the ground." A ripple of surprise went through the cabin. Shannon wasn't a major hub. It was a quiet stop on the edge of the Atlantic, mostly used for refueling. But it had customs, police, and the ability to handle incidents like this quickly. Dale's face went from red to pale. "You're kidding me," he muttered. "Because of this?" He gestured toward Eli like he was pointing at a spilled drink, not a person. No one answered him. Even the passengers who'd seemed indifferent earlier now avoided his gaze. One man actually shifted seats, moving 2 rows forward without a word. As the plane descended, the tension didn't ease. It settled, like dust after a storm. People stared out windows, fiddled with phones, or closed their eyes tight as if pretending they could wake up somewhere else. Eli sat back down, the napkin still pressed to his cheek. He thought about calling his father, but he knew Julian would already be on his way. Word traveled fast in their world. 40 minutes felt like 4 hours. When the wheels touched down, the cabin stayed silent. No applause for landing, just the low whine of reverse thrusters and the hiss of brakes. Outside, the Irish sky was gray and misty, the runway lights glowing like distant stars. 2 police cars and an airport security van waited near the gate. The captain taxied to a remote stand, away from the main terminal. No other planes nearby. This wasn't a normal stop, it was a controlled situation. Once the engines powered down, the lead bodyguard turned to the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. Local authorities will board shortly to take statements. Please remain calm and cooperate." Then he walked over to Eli. "You okay to talk to them?" Eli nodded. "Yeah, I want to." Dale, meanwhile, was sweating. He kept checking his watch, then his phone, then the door. "This is insane," he kept muttering. It was one slap. People get into fights all the time on planes. But this wasn't a fight. It was one-sided. And everyone knew it. When the police entered, 2 officers in dark uniforms, calm and professional, they didn't rush. They spoke first with the flight crew, then with the bodyguards, then with passengers who'd witnessed the incident. Several had recorded video. One young man handed over his phone without being asked. "It's all there," he said quietly. Eli gave his statement next. He spoke clearly, without anger, just facts. He said, "Boy, I asked him not to call me that. He slapped me. I didn't touch him before that." The officer listened, nodding, taking notes. "Did you know him before the flight?" "No, never seen him in my life. Any reason he'd act that way?" Eli hesitated, then said, "I think you know the reason." The officer didn't argue, just wrote it down. Dale's turn came last. He tried to spin it. Misunderstanding. He was being aggressive. I was provoked. But his story fell apart fast. No one backed him up. Not a single passenger. Even the man who'd been sleeping through most of the flight woke up long enough to say, "I saw the whole thing." The kid didn't do a thing. Within an hour, the police made their decision. Dale would not be continuing to New York. He'd be taken into custody for questioning, and likely charged with assault. As they led him off the plane, hands not cuffed, but flanked by officers, Dale turned back once, his eyes locking with Eli's. There was no apology in that look, just shame and something else, fear. Maybe for the first time he realized what he'd really done, not just hit someone, but exposed himself. Eli watched him go, then looked out the window at the rainy tarmac. He wasn't angry anymore, just tired, His father's private jet was already on the ground at Shannon waiting to take him home. But before he left, Eli asked the lead officer a question. "Will this go public?" The officer sighed. "With all the recordings, probably. But it's not up to me." Eli nodded. He knew what that meant. By tomorrow this would be everywhere, and he was ready. Not for fame or drama, but because silence had never protected anyone like him before. As he walked down the jetway, hoodie pulled up against the Irish drizzle. He didn't look back. The plane, the passengers, the slap, they were part of a moment now. But what came next? That was his to shape. The rain in Shannon was soft but steady, the kind that soaks you without you noticing until your shoes are squelching. Eli stood under the awning of the small airport terminal, arms crossed, watching as ground crew guided his father's jet toward the gate. He hadn't said much since stepping off the commercial flight. The adrenaline had drained out of him, leaving behind a quiet exhaustion, and something else harder to name. Not fear, not anger, more like clarity. His father was already inside the private terminal, pacing near the coffee machine like a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 hours. When he saw Eli, he stopped. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. No dramatic hug, no shouting. Just two people who understood without words that something had shifted. "You okay?" Julian asked, voice rough. Eli nodded. "Yeah, just tired." Julian reached out, touched his son's shoulder, lightly, like he was afraid Eli might flinch. "I saw the footage," Eli winced. "It's already out?" "Within 20 minutes of landing. Someone posted it on social media. It's got hundreds of thousands of views already." Eli closed his eyes. He'd known it would spread, but hearing it made it real. His face, his pain, was now public property. Strangers would dissect it, argue about it, use it as proof of whatever they already believed. That thought made his stomach twist. Back in the main terminal, Dale was being processed. Not in cuffs, but not free either. Irish authorities were handling it carefully. Assault on an aircraft was serious, especially with multiple witnesses and video evidence. He'd be held overnight, questioned, then likely handed over to U.S. officials once extradition paperwork moved through. His passport had already been flagged. Meanwhile, the airline issued a short statement. "We take all incidents of passenger misconduct seriously. The individual in question has been removed from the flight and is cooperating with local authorities." Vague, safe, corporate, but it was enough to send news outlets scrambling. By the time Eli and his father boarded the private jet, headlines were forming. Not just local news, national, then international. The story had everything: wealth, race, violence at 30,000 feet. But what made it stick wasn't the billionaire angle. It was how ordinary it felt. People saw themselves in it. Maybe they'd been on a flight where someone acted entitled. Maybe they'd been the one treated like a threat for no reason. Or maybe they just remembered how it felt to watch someone get humiliated and not know what to do. Eli tried to sleep on the short hop back to New York, but his mind wouldn't settle. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that word again, boy, and felt the sting of the slap. Not because it hurt, but because it wasn't about him. It was about what Dale saw when he looked at him. Not a student, not a son, not even a person. Just a stereotype. When they landed in Westchester, two things happened at once. First, Eli's mother was waiting on the tarmac, wrapped in a thick coat despite the mild night. She didn't say anything, just pulled him into a hug so tight he could feel her heartbeat. That's when the tears came. Not big sobs, just quiet, steady drops he hadn't realized he was holding back. Second, his phone lit up like a Christmas tree. Messages from friends, professors, distant relatives, news outlets requesting interviews. A lawyer from the family's security team confirming that Dale's employer, a mid-sized logistics company in Ohio, had already issued a statement. "We are aware of the incident and are conducting an internal review. Mr. Mercer is not currently representing the company in any capacity." Translation: he was fired before he even made bail. Over the next 48 hours, the internet did what it always does. It dug. Old social media posts surfaced. Comments Dale had made years ago about certain neighborhoods, rants about entitlement, complaints about coworkers playing the race card. Nothing overtly violent, but enough to paint a picture. Enough to show this wasn't a one-time outburst. It was a pattern. Eli watched it unfold from his childhood bedroom, blinds drawn. He didn't post anything, didn't give interviews, but he read the comments. Some people called for justice. Others said it was just a slap, get over it. A few claimed Eli provoked it by being disrespectful. That last one made him laugh, a dry, humorless sound. He'd said 3 sentences. 3. His father sat with him one evening, both of them on the back porch, mugs of tea steaming in the cool air. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to," Julian said. "We can let the legal system handle it. Walk away." Eli stared into his mug. But what if walking away means it happens again? To someone else who doesn't have bodyguards? Who doesn't have a dad with a private jet? Julian didn't answer right away. He knew his son well enough to know this wasn't about revenge. It was about responsibility. The next morning, Eli made a decision. He wouldn't push for the harshest punishment. Jail time fines, those wouldn't change Dale's mind. But he would insist on 2 things: a public apology and mandatory anti-bias training as part of any plea deal. Not as punishment, but as a chance, however small, for Dale to understand why what he did mattered. His legal team reached out to the prosecutor. The airline, sensing the public mood, quietly offered to cover counseling for any passengers who felt traumatized by the incident. One flight attendant later told a reporter she'd never forget the look on Eli's face. Not anger, but disappointment. "Like he expected better from people," she said. Back online, the conversation shifted. Less about the slap, more about the word that came before it. Teachers shared stories of students called boy in hallways. Nurses talked about being mistaken for orderlies. Veterans spoke about being asked if they really served. The incident became a doorway, small but open. Eli still hadn't spoken publicly, but his silence wasn't empty. It was full of thought, full of weight. And when he finally did speak, weeks later at a community forum on youth safety, he didn't mention Dale by name. Didn't call for outrage. Just said simply, "I didn't ask to be a symbol. But if my story helps one person think twice before speaking or striking, then it's worth it." By then, Dale had been released on bail, ordered to stay in his home state, and enrolled in a court-mandated program on cultural sensitivity and conflict resolution. He hadn't posted anything online, hadn't given interviews. Maybe he was ashamed. Maybe he was just waiting for the storm to pass. But storms don't pass when you hide from them. They pass when people choose to build something stronger in their wake. And Eli? He went back to school. But he carried the lesson with him, not as a wound, but as a compass. Because dignity isn't something you earn by staying quiet. Sometimes it's something you claim by standing still, even when the world tries to knock you down. Weeks passed and the world moved on, as it always does. The headlines faded. The trending hashtags disappeared. New scandals, new crises, new stories took their place. But for the people who lived through that flight, time didn't erase what happened. It just gave them space to decide what to do with it. Dale Mercer returned to his hometown quieter than he'd left it. No job, no routine. Just a small apartment, court dates, and the slow, grinding weight of public shame. His neighbors avoided eye contact. Old friends stopped returning calls. Even the local diner where he used to get coffee every morning suddenly forgot his usual order. He wasn't in jail, but he might as well have been. The internet had done its work. His name was tied to a moment he couldn't take back. He started the court-mandated anti-bias training program reluctantly, arms crossed, jaw tight, like he was doing it under protest. The first session was held in a community center basement, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The facilitator wasn't preachy. She didn't yell or shame. She just asked questions. When did you first learn that some people belong and others don't? When did you realize your words could hurt someone, even if you didn't mean to? Dale didn't answer at first. But as the weeks went on, something shifted. Not all at once, but in small, quiet ways. He listened to stories from people who'd been followed in stores, questioned in their own neighborhoods, treated like suspects for no reason. He heard about kids who learned to keep their hands visible before they learned to tie their shoes. And for the first time, he wondered, what if that had been my son? He still didn't fully understand, but he stopped denying, and that, the facilitator said, was the first real step. Meanwhile, Eli was back on campus trying to return to normal, but normal felt different now. Professors looked at him with a new kind of respect, not because of his father's money, but because of how he'd handled everything. Classmates who'd barely spoken to him before now asked thoughtful questions. Not about the slap, but about what came after. One afternoon, a student group invited him to speak at a panel on public safety and racial bias. He almost said no. He didn't want to be the guy from the plane video, but then he remembered the flight attendant's words. He expected better from people. Maybe that was the point. Not to be a hero, but to hold on to that expectation even when it's hard, he agreed. And when he spoke, he kept it simple. No grand speeches, no anger. Just truth. I didn't do anything special. I just didn't lie down. And I think everyone deserves the right to exist in public without being treated like a threat. After the talk, a first-year student, a young woman with tired eyes and a nervous smile, waited to speak with him. "My brother got stopped by police last week," she said quietly. "Just for walking home from the library. They said he fit a description. He's 16. She paused. "Did you ever feel like it's pointless to speak up?" Eli thought for a moment. "Yeah, all the time. But then I remember, silence is what lets it keep happening." That conversation stayed with him, and it sparked an idea. He reached out to a nonprofit that documented everyday racism in public spaces, buses, stores, airports, parks. They'd been collecting anonymous reports for years, but few people knew about them. Eli offered to help amplify their work. Not with money, though his family did make a quiet donation, but with his voice. He helped design a simple mobile tool where people could log incidents safely, with options to report to authorities or just share their story. No names, no pressure, just proof that these moments weren't isolated. They were part of a pattern. His father, watching from the sidelines, didn't interfere. He'd learned long ago that his son didn't need protection from the world. He needed space to change it. Back in Ohio, Dale completed his training program. As part of his agreement with the court, he had to write a letter. Not for social media, not for the news, but directly to Eli. It took him 3 tries to get it right. The first draft was full of excuses. The second sounded like a robot wrote it. The third? That one was raw. "I called you boy because I was angry," he wrote. "But the truth is, I didn't see you as a person. And that's on me, not you. I can't take back what I did. But I'm trying to understand why I did it. I hope you're okay. And I'm sorry." Eli read it alone in his dorm room. He didn't reply, not because he didn't believe the apology, but because forgiveness wasn't the point. Accountability was. And Dale had finally taken that step, not for the cameras, not for the court, but for himself. The airline, watching all this unfold, quietly rolled out new crew training focused on de-escalation and implicit bias. Flight attendants now had clearer protocols for handling verbal harassment, not just physical violence. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and Eli, he kept going. Not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a young man who'd seen how fragile dignity can be, and decided to help protect it for others. One evening, he called his mom. "I think I want to switch my major," he said. "Maybe add a minor in social policy," she laughed softly. "Your father's going to say I told you so. He always said you'd find your purpose." "Maybe," Eli said, smiling for the first time in weeks. "But I think I'm just finally listening to the world." Outside his window, students walked across campus, laughing, arguing, living. None of them knew what he'd been through. And that was okay, because the goal wasn't to be remembered for what happened on that plane. It was to make sure fewer people had to go through it at all. And in that quiet determination, in the choice to turn pain into purpose, there was something deeply human. Not loud, not flashy, just real. That's where real change starts. Not with a slap, but with a decision to do better, even when no one's watching. Months later, life had settled into a new kind of rhythm, quieter, but deeper. The storm had passed, but the landscape it left behind was different for everyone involved. Dale Mercer still lived in the same town, but he moved through it like a ghost. He'd found part-time work at a hardware store, stocking shelves, sweeping floors, tasks that didn't require much talking. His co-workers didn't bring up the incident. They didn't need to. The silence said enough. He went to his court-mandated counseling sessions without complaint now, not because he enjoyed them, but because he'd started to see them as something other than punishment. They were a mirror, and for the first time in his life, he was trying to look into it without flinching. He hadn't magically become a different person. Old habits still flickered, like when he caught himself clutching his wallet tighter around certain strangers, or assuming the worst before knowing the facts. But now he noticed those thoughts, and sometimes, just sometimes, he stopped them before they turned into words or actions. That wasn't redemption, it was just the beginning of responsibility. He never posted online about his experience, never gave interviews. He knew the world wouldn't believe him if he tried to frame himself as reformed, and maybe he didn't deserve that label yet. But he was trying, not for applause, but because the alternative, living with the memory of that slap and the look in that young man's eyes, was unbearable. Meanwhile, Eli had returned to campus, but he wasn't the same kid who'd boarded that flight in London. He carried himself differently, not with anger, but with a quiet certainty. He'd stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped lowering his voice when he spoke in class, stopped scanning rooms for exits out of habit. He'd also started volunteering with the non-profit he'd helped expand. Once a week, he met with students who'd experienced harassment in public, on subways and coffee shops, at airports. He didn't give advice. He just listened. And in those conversations, he realized something important. Healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about refusing to let fear write your story. One rainy afternoon, he sat with a group of high schoolers who'd been followed in a mall. One boy, barely 15, said, "I just wish people saw me before they saw my skin." Eli nodded. "Me too," he said. "But until they do, we have to see ourselves clearly and protect each other." That became his quiet mission, not to change the whole world overnight, but to build small circles of safety wherever he could. His father watched all this with pride, but also with caution. He'd spent years shielding his son from the harsher edges of life, thinking wealth could be a buffer. Now he understood it wasn't. Money could buy security, but it couldn't buy dignity. That had to be claimed, defended, and sometimes fought for, even on a crowded plane. The airline never issued another public statement about the incident. But behind the scenes, they'd made real changes. Flight crews now received annual training on recognizing and intervening in bias-based harassment. There was a new protocol for de-escalation that didn't rely solely on calling police, because sometimes the presence of law enforcement made things worse, not better. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And it had begun with one slap. One young man who refused to stay silent, and dozens of passengers who chose to speak up. Back in Ireland, the flight attendant who'd handed Eli a napkin kept the memory close. She later told a colleague, "I'll never forget how calm he was," like he'd been preparing his whole life for that moment. She started mentoring new hires, reminding them that kindness in a crisis could be as powerful as any rule book. As for Eli, he didn't become an activist overnight. He didn't drop out of school or launch a foundation. He just kept showing up as a student, a son, a friend. But now when he walked into a room, people didn't just see a billionaire's kid. They saw someone who'd faced humiliation with grace and turned it into something useful. One evening, months after the flight, he sat on his dorm's rooftop with a few close friends. The city lights stretched out below them, endless and humming. Someone asked, "Do you ever think about him? The guy who hit you?" Eli was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said finally. "Not with hate. More like curiosity. I wonder if he wakes up thinking about it. If he's trying to be better." "He should be," one friend muttered. "Maybe," Eli said. "But I can't control that. All I can control is what I do next." And what he did next was simple. He kept living. He studied. He laughed. He argued about movies and stayed up too late texting his little sister. He went home for holidays and hugged his mom a little longer than usual. He even flew again, business class, same as before, but this time he sat up straighter. Not out of fear, but out of ownership. The sky belonged to everyone. The story never really ended. It just folded into the lives of everyone it touched. For some, it was a warning. For others, a wake-up call. For Eli, it was a turning point. Not because he was special, but because he chose to treat pain as a teacher instead of a weapon. And in the end, that's what made the difference. Not the slap. Not the headlines. Not the billionaire father or the diverted flight. But the quiet, stubborn choice to believe that people can change, and that dignity is worth defending even when it's hard. Years from now, when someone asks what happened on that flight, the details might blur. But the feeling won't. The feeling that one moment of cruelty can ripple outward, but so can one act of courage. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do after being knocked down is to stand back up, look the world in the eye and say without shouting, I'm still here. And I matter. That's not a story with a neat ending. It's a story that keeps going, carried forward by people who refuse to let hate be the last word. There was never supposed to be a part 6. The story had wrapped itself neatly. 5 parts. A beginning, a middle, and something close enough to an ending. People moved on. The internet found new fires to feed, but life doesn't always follow scripts. Sometimes, long after the cameras stop rolling and the headlines fade, the real work begins. And sometimes that work leads to a quiet knock on a door no one expected. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday in early spring. Eli was home for a long weekend, sorting through old boxes in the garage. College applications from his younger sister. Holiday decorations his mom refused to throw out. A dusty guitar he'd sworn he'd learn to play someday. The sun was warm. The air smelled like cut grass, and for once, his mind was quiet. Then the doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone. His parents were at work. His sister was at track practice. He wiped his hands on his jeans and walked to the front door, half expecting a delivery he'd forgotten about. But standing on the porch was a man he hadn't seen since that flight. Older now, thinner, wearing a plain jacket and holding a folded piece of paper like it was something fragile. Dale. Eli didn't open the door all the way. He left the chain on just enough to see clearly. His heart didn't race. It just paused, like the world had taken a breath. I know I shouldn't be here, Dale said, voice low. And if you tell me to leave, I will. I just needed to say it in person. Eli studied him. This wasn't the man from the plane, the flushed, angry stranger who'd acted like the world owed him space. This man looked tired, not in a dramatic way, but in the way people do after carrying something heavy for too long. After a long moment, Eli unhooked the chain and opened the door. They didn't hug. Didn't shake hands. Just stood there, 2 people bound by a moment neither of them wanted but couldn't escape. I finished the program, Dale said. All of it. The counseling, the community service, the workshops. And I've been going to a local group. People trying to unlearn the stuff they were taught growing up. He paused. It's harder than I thought. Eli nodded. It usually is. I also lost my apartment, Dale added, almost like an afterthought. Couldn't afford it after. Everything. I've been staying with my sister. She barely talks to me, but she lets me sleep on her couch. He wasn't asking for pity, just stating facts. And that honesty, more than anything, made Eli step aside. Come in, he said. They sat at the kitchen table, Eli with a glass of water, Dale with his hands wrapped around a mug of tea he hadn't touched. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching dust motes in the air. It felt surreal, like 2 characters from a story meeting outside the pages. I didn't come to ask for forgiveness, Dale said after a while. I know that's not mine to demand. I came because I needed you to know I remember your face, not just from the video, from that moment, and I'm ashamed of what I did to you. Eli looked down at his glass. I remember your face too, not because of the slap, because of what it said before you even raised your hand. Dale swallowed hard. Yeah, they sat in silence for a minute. Not awkward, just chill. Then Eli asked, why now? Because I got a job offer, Dale said. In another state. Warehouse work. Nothing fancy, but it's a start. And before I leave, I wanted to make sure I didn't carry that moment with me like a secret. I wanted to face it. Eli thought about that. He'd spent months turning his pain into purpose, speaking, organizing, listening. But he'd never imagined the person who caused it would show up, not to defend himself, but to acknowledge the harm. That takes courage, Eli said finally. Dale shook his head. Not really. You're the one who showed courage. I just stopped running. Before he left, Dale handed Eli the folded paper. It was a letter, not the court-ordered one, but something he'd written on his own. In it, he talked about growing up in a town where difference was treated like danger, about never questioning the stories he was told, about how shame had kept him silent for years. And at the end, he wrote, I can't undo what I did, but I can spend the rest of my life making sure I never do it again, and helping others see what I was too blind to see. Eli read it later, alone. He didn't keep it on his wall, didn't post it online, but he tucked it into the back of his journal, between pages filled with notes from community meetings and ideas for the nonprofit. A week later, Dale moved away. No fanfare, no news coverage, just a U-Haul and a new start, and Eli? He went back to his life, but with a new understanding. Change isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a man showing up on a porch with nothing but regret and a willingness to be seen. Sometimes healing isn't about grand gestures, but about two people sitting at a kitchen table, finally seeing each other as human. Months after that, Eli gave a talk at a high school. A student asked, "Do you think people like him really change?" Eli didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I don't know if people change all at once, but I do know they can choose every day to act differently than they did yesterday, and sometimes that's enough." He didn't mention Dale by name. Didn't need to. The lesson wasn't about one man. It was about the space between harm and healing, and how if both sides are willing, even the deepest wounds can be